Old societies used to protect people from a contact with God. I think they were pretty wise in their point of view that only a few people could stand the impact of a vision of God. So much of traditional religion consists of protecting people from that numinous experience which would be too big for them. A person who is touched by a vision of God too soon or in a deeper sense than he has the capacity to survive it will be a severely wounded person. Really, that's the Fisher King, the wounded experience. He touches God, he eats the salmon too soon, illegitimately, and suffers a terrible wound from this. The fish has been the symbol of Christ since the very beginning of Christian times. And I think the church, in its very conservative way, and its very practical view, would have us take a little bit of the nature of Christ at the altar rail during communion. All of this implies the role of the priest who makes a way or a bridge or a hinge between this world and the next world. That's the duty of a true priest. It's a wonderful thing to be in the presence of somebody whose consciousness is informed by the visionary world which he has experienced. But that's not very frequent. And I think probably half of the suffering of modern people could be canceled out or alleviated just in one stroke by understanding the nature of that suffering. If we understand that we're fisher kings and that we have bitten off the salmon and that this is a noble task and is going to yield a wonderful cultural product, then one doesn't have to be guilty over it anymore. And that's half the suffering canceled out right there. One needn't be frightened or guilty any longer. But half of the suffering is alleviated the moment one understands that there's meaning in it. The one unforgivable or unbearable form of suffering is meaninglessness. And men, ever since that wound, because it's happened to all of Western man since then, makes a man doubt his creativity or his ability, gives him his sense of inferiority, or makes him question whether he can ever generate or not. And when a woman feels inferior, she's frightened of her ability to do anything. She doesn't think she's worth anything. And when a man is overtaken by this kind of inferiority, he doubts his capacity to create. There are dimensions of this that I didn't have any idea of. I had no basis from which to understand it until I got out of the Western world. I was in the Orient. I saw people who were not Fisher King wounded for the first time in my life. And then I began to understand what the wound was. The wound is so ubiquitous with us, the one doesn't know any other condition. But if you get to India, you'll see unwounded people and get some insight and sense of who we are and what we're carrying around with us. 1 in 10 of us breaks under the Fisher King wound, breaks to the point of requiring hospitalization. And the other 9/10 of us go around containing our wound and our suffering as best we can. Almost everybody I know is lonely. If you can get a person to talk frankly and freely to you, he will tell you about his hurts, and a great deal of it is his sense of isolation or his sense of aloneness. It's incredible to go to India and see people with 1/100th of the wealth and the convenience that we have being happier than we are. A kind of existential suffering, as it's called in the West now, not known in traditional India. because they never made the Fisher King wound. They are unwounded people, psychologically speaking. Now, physically, they're in terrible shape. It left me speechless to find out that in an Indian family, everybody knows in what order they will starve to death if food gets scarce. The youngest girl goes first, and they go up the line of girls, and then the youngest boy starves if food is getting more and more scarce. And so it goes. In that dimension, they're in terrible straits. But psychologically, they are unwounded and much happier than we are. They never bit on that stuff of individualism or individuation. That's probably the greatest difference between an Oriental and an Occidental, is that we harbor this concept, for better or for worse, and there's some of both, that I am an individual, I am unique. The moment I say that or adopt that concept, I'm immediately a Fisher King with salmon in my mouth and an incurable ache in my groin. It's so interesting to observe what a Westerner means by individuation and what an Easterner is likely to mean by enlightenment. A Westerner generally implies, though he may use varying language for it, that he brings his individuality or his uniqueness to an absolute pitch. And a Westerner would call that enlightenment. And an Easterner would call enlightenment the extinction of individuality or separateness or uniqueness. If you ask an Eastern teacher, does one still exist after enlightenment? He will ask you, does the dewdrop still exist after it falls back into the ocean? And while you're trying to puzzle that one out, he's gone off to afternoon tea. Of course the dewdrop still exists, but not as a dewdrop anymore. An Easterner likes to temper his idea of the extinction of any personality or individuality by saying that a truly enlightened person is the ultimately compassionate person, which means he is aware of the rest of mankind. Buddha, in his compassion, consented to stay on the face of the earth after his enlightenment and be a teacher, which certainly takes the rest of mankind into consideration. So I think these two things are simply the north and the south path up the mountain to the top, and they arrive at the same place.